Hello and welcome to another edition of Choose the Challenge. I am LaWanna Bradford and I'm excited to be here today. It is Veterans Day and we have a special episode entitled Preserving Your History and Telling Your Story. Why did I feel that was so important today? Well, as we know, Veterans Day, the 11th day of the 11th month, is a time when we here in the U.S. pause, recognize, celebrate, and salute those men and women who have served this great country of ours. We think about their victories, their defeats, as well as their stories. These stories and their work within our greater culture and community really shape the fiber of our nation. It is the heartbeat, if you will, of our nation that helps us to really embrace the truth of democracy. Now, many of you may say, well, LaWanna, that sounds great, but I don't believe that we're there yet. We may not be there, but these men and women have sacrificed their lives, sometimes their families, for the red, white, and blue. And it's important that today and other days, that not only do we salute and recognize them, but we tell their stories. And that's what brought me here today. As you see, what am I wearing? I'm wearing Buffalo Soldier regalia here. I have on my father's Buffalo Soldier jacket. And this means so much to me because my father passed away September 16th of this year. And not only was he a proud military veteran. He served this nation for 30 years, and he always says, remember the 30 days from 1948 to 1978, and continued his service working with Department of Defense once he retired from the military, and even up until a little over, well, actually a year ago today, my father was participating in the Veterans Day Parade. It was so important to preserve the military history, to tell our story from the men and women who served. It was also very important for him to celebrate not only our military history, but our Black military history. And that's why I've entitled this Preserving Your Story, Preserving Your History and Telling Your Story. We can leave our story up to chance, right? We can allow someone else to craft the narrative as they see fit through their limited lens in history books, decide what will or will not be taught in schools. Or we can choose to empower ourselves, not silence our mouths, and tell our story. Tell our story as we want it to be seen, feel, and heard by our children and their children's children. The one thing that really surprised me is I was reading something and they said that on average, when an individual passes away, their legacy is only remembered by 2 generations. So that means their children and their grandchildren. That's a little frightening because you're thinking, wait a minute, is that really the case? But ask yourself, how far back can you go in your family's history, not just saying the names of individuals, but where you feel like I have a really deep sense of knowing of who they were, the time that they lived in, what they believed in, what their hopes and dreams were for their children's children? Do you know that? Have those conversations been shared throughout your family? Most often the answer is not really. Well, I'm going to come back in just a minute. I'm going to tell you about a story, actually 2 stories that I heard today. Today, I had the opportunity to serve as proxy for my father in the Veterans Day parades, my very first Veterans Day parade I've ever participated in. My father, as I mentioned, had been in the military for 30 years. And I have to say, I keep saying 30 days. And since he was 17, he had never missed a Veterans Day parade or ceremony. It was so important to him. And I think next to Christmas, This was number 2, and then his birthday was number 3 as far as key celebrations. And I often talk to him to ask why. But it wasn't until today that I put on his jacket that he wore, a jacket that we were never allowed to try on. He's had this jacket for decades, and on the back is a big Buffalo Soldier emblem. But putting that on and suiting up next to the other members of the, see, I have SWAPs here, Southwest Association of Buffalo Soldiers, gave me a greater sense of pride, right? And even a deeper sense of belonging, even though I knew who my father was, his history, and what he represented. Today, it felt a little bit different because I was able to dip my toes in the water and sort of walk in his shoes just a little bit. So we'll be back in a moment as we talk about how you can preserve your history and tell your story. And wait to the end, because I'm going to give you some tools and tips that you can do with your family today to begin to preserve your history and tell your story. We'll be right back. Well, we can't keep moving forward, right, with this conversation. It's Veterans Day. So let's take a moment to salute our men and women who serve this great nation. I'm LaWanna Bradford, host of Choose a Challenge, and that handsome gentleman that you saw at the end of that commercial was my father, Sergeant Major Harlan L. Bradford Sr. And I want to weave just a little bit of the conversations that I've had with him over the years to this point in time. As I mentioned, this is Veterans Day, and having the opportunity to don his jacket and to join the lineup of hundreds of military veterans celebrating who they are and what they stand for and what they fought for. Also being part of the sub-community of the Buffalo Soldier organization and really feeling pride in that. And the pride that I felt is because over the years, my father has helped me to understand this part of history. See, he said when he joined in 1948, June 1st, 1948, it was still a segregated army. That's kind of hard for us to wrap our heads around right now, right? That you go into a situation and it is segregated. So our defense was segregated. And that same year, President Truman signed into law integrating the armed forces. But it wasn't until 1951 that there was full integration of our armed forces. So in 1948, as I mentioned, it was still a segregated army. In fact, the segregation began in 1866 to 1948. And as such, my father can still have the recognition as being one of the Buffalo Soldiers. Even though it was on the cusp and it was going out, he was still part of a segregated army. And I asked him, I said, well, did you guys call yourself Buffalo Soldiers? He said, no, actually we didn't. We were just part of the U.S. Army. And We just happened to be on the black side of the house, but we were part of the U.S. Army. And I'm like, well, where did this name Buffalo Soldier come from? Again, this is understanding the history. And he said, actually came from the Native Americans. And we are in what? Native American Heritage Month. So what a wonderful intersect there. And he said that because of they witnessed the fierce fighting spirit of African American soldiers, their resilience, their determination, their grit, and also because of the hair texture, curly, tight. All of these characteristics reminded them of the strength and the might of the buffalo. And for them, it was a term of respect, a term of honor. And so now, those of us who are part of that legacy, but even knowing as part of the American history and the African American history, military history, it is something to be proud of. It is something to celebrate what these troops did during that time. And so when we think about telling our story, it's important that you, as well as I, sit down with our sons, our daughters, our nieces, our nephews, other family members, and start to remember the beauty of our story and begin to create our own unique tapestry. We can choose to allow our voices to be silent for whatever reason. Maybe it's too painful. Maybe we feel, what does it matter? We think our story is too small to share with someone else. But every life is great, and everyone has an imprint, and everyone has a story that is worthy and deserving to be told. And the one thing we don't want to do is have our own narrative shaped by someone else, by someone who doesn't have a lived experience, but they are the ones that are controlling the narrative. They decide what's being shared in our history books, in our schools, on our media. But what if we became actively involved in our story? And when I say we, I'm talking about we, the collective of humanity. This is not a racial conversation or talking about, political groups or parties. This is just truly saying, do you know your history? Do you really know your family history? Because what I found is when we start to do a little digging and we understand the ties that bind, it helps us better understand ourselves. Why we may have an affinity for one thing versus another. Why we may be passionate about a certain cause. Why we may have certain gifts and talents. You never know. And I'll give you an example. I was talking to my dad, and he loved poetry. And he was a wonderful orator. And he loved to recite poetry. And I was going through some of his old paperwork, and I found his stepmother's journal. And she was not the nicest of stepmothers. She was kind of fit the title of wicked stepmother. But he always honored her. He always respected her. And I asked him, I said, Dad, what did you think about Grandma Hazel and her view of you? And he said, I don't think she probably thought much of me. And then I read to him some passages from her journal where she was elevating and celebrating him. Though she had never verbally shared these feelings with him, there it was in her journal. What a find. Here my father is in his 90s, and his paradigm about his stepmother and what she thought of him quickly changed. I also read different poems that she had written in her journal, or major or significant quotes from influencers of the day. And I said, Dad, I think you may have gotten a lot of these qualities that you have from Grandma Hazel. And he's like, how about that? I share that to say there's so much about ourselves that really comes from exposure to our environment, to the secondary and primary socialization that we have, right? Those around us have shaped and influenced us in some way. Sometimes we know about it, but very often we don't. We're not really certain. And that's where I just felt at this day to really talk about the importance of preserving your history and telling your story, to not leave it up to chance, to craft it in such a way and to use vehicles. I mean, we are so blessed to be in a digital era, right? To use vehicles of convenience that will ensure that who you are, what you value, what you stood for, and the time you lived in doesn't just die 2 generations down, but it's something that can be embraced and celebrated for generations to come. I don't know about you, but that excites me to know that I now have an opportunity to control this narrative, to control the discourse, and to shape in an honest and clear and transparent way so that the future generations of Bradfords, my family, can learn from, grow from, expand from, and improve upon life so that there are greater opportunities for those that are coming behind me. I'm going to pause for a moment and we will get right back to preserving your history and telling your story. We are back. I'm LaWanna Bradford, and we are here on Choose the Challenge to talk about preserving your history, telling your story. Choose the Challenge is a platform where we are challenging our mindsets, systems, institutions, relationships, things that may get in the way to prevent you from elevating to your highest and best self, whatever that may be for you. And sometimes being able to elevate to your highest and best self is being able to be true to yourself, tell your story, and not fear expressing yourself. Don't sideline yourself. We all have a wonderful web, if you will, of experiences that represent who we are and how we relate and interrelate one to another. When we share these stories, it helps our children better understand. It helps them to make decisions that will help empower them, because they're not just shooting blind, excuse the term shooting, but they are going from a place of solid reference, right? One of the things we want to do is when we're telling our story, we are safeguarding our legacy. So number one, when we tell our story, we're not allowing our voice to be silent, number one. Number two, we're not allowing the narrative to be changed or shaped by someone else, right? We are controlling that story. Number three, we're safeguarding the legacy for future generations. See, if I depended on only what I'm reading in certain history books or the only messages that I may be receiving in certain classrooms, I can tell you right now, I wouldn't have known about the Buffalo Soldier. As I mentioned, the Black African-American military in the segregated army, they did not refer to themselves as Buffalo Soldier. The Cheyenne did. And soon that name became synonymous with those who fought and served from 1866 until 1951. So understanding, again, the history, the nuances is so important. We've often heard the term, if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it, right? So we want to study and show ourselves approved. We want to study our families, not bury our heads in the sand and say, I see no evil, speak no evil, hear no evil. I just don't want to deal with it. I remember speaking to my great grandmother years ago, and I wanted to know a lot about our two parts, our Native American ancestry. And I also wanted to know about her mother, who was in fact a slave. And she refused to tell us anything about that time. She's like, why do you want to know that? And I'm like, because it's a part of history. She's like, nah, you'll be better off, with that left unsaid. So I walked away only knowing three things. I knew where my grandmother, my great great grandmother, who was a slave, grew up. I knew her name, and I knew how many children that she had. And I knew that she happened to be a slave. That was it. How sad. So again, I'm sharing my lived experience. How sad that I knew my great grandmother. And again, I'm not an itty bitty having this conversation. I am a teenager having this conversation with her, but she didn't want to share. And even when I spoke to her children about it, my grandmother, my great uncles, that was about all they had to say. They didn't really have much more to gnaw on. There weren't any stories. So we can share our history by gathering around and telling the stories and allowing the Q&A to help to aid and develop the put some bones, right, around that, some meat rather, around the bones of the story. So that's my experience. And I'm so grateful, as I mentioned, with my father, even though he's no longer with us. He and I always would talk, and he would share little things with me. But I became intentional during the pandemic. And I said, Dad, why don't we use this time to begin kind of doing a video journal of you and your life? And I'll be the interviewer, and you just tell me about your life in your own words. I'll just go through every possible imaginable question, from your favorite Christmas to your favorite food to what you feel, your political views. I mean, we were talking about everything. And I am so grateful because now I have over 40 hours of footage of my dad and I having this back and forth conversation where I walked away better understanding who he is, why he thinks the way he thinks, and why he acted the way he acted. Think about this. My father was born in 1930 at the beginning of the Depression. He was an orphan. His mother passed away when he was 2 years old in childbirth. His father passed away when he was 10 years old, and the same year he lost his grandfather. He was raised, as I mentioned, literally by a wicked stepmother. He was a baby of his siblings, and all of them were adults. The one closest to him was 6 years older. So he didn't have that type of sibling influence around him. And he grew up in a community of 250, a German community in the heart of Missouri of 250 people. That was a population. And somehow through that limited lens, he rose up and did some great and amazing things, from speaking 4 languages fluently, traveling the world, rising to the highest enlisted rank in the military, and then becoming this huge advocate of history and the preserving of history. To his greatest, I think one of his greatest legacies is he fought for 22 years. He and a team fought to preserve a building on Fort Huachuca, which was a Black officers club, or NCO club at that time. And you had individuals like Lena Horne and Louis Armstrong who came and performed there. And they were going to tear it down. And so after petitioning and writing letters, I mean, you can find the articles in the New York Times. I mean, they were so committed to the task that we cannot let this piece of our history just be bulldozed down because it's an old building. And the great accolade for my dad and the team was they were able to get it placed on the National Historic Registry. So that's when I talk about preserving your history and telling your story. Sometimes you have to be willing to fight. right? And overcome some barriers and hurdles, especially if it's something very unique that you want to make sure that you capture. So it may not just be your family history, it may be the history of your community. It may be a broader piece of history, like in this case, this building has national significance. Before we close, I want to give you some tips on what you can do with your family today to begin to preserve your history and tell your story. Number one, be willing to tell your story. The good, the bad, the ugly, be willing to unpackage it and have a conversation. Dig as deep as you can and share that information and allow yourself to be questioned about different things. Create this opportunity for your family to come together as one in capturing and chronicling your family's history. Well, how do you do that besides conversations? Well, you can do it in a myriad of ways. Like I said, with me, I did a video journal with my dad. You may actually do an audio journal, or just recording the conversations that you have. It may not be as formally structured as what I did. You may ask them, do you have old letters? Do you have cards? Do you have old clippings from newspapers? That will tell you a lot about what was happening in that time, but also what may have been of interest to them. Like, I looked at some of my dad's writings because he loved to journal, but he loved to write. And I knew that he was passionate about civil rights, but I didn't realize how much he wrote about the inequities and injustice that we experienced in this country at that time. And in reading it, it let me see through his lens what he was experiencing, even finding some of his letters that he wrote from Vietnam or from the Korean War. I was like, wow. It was, again, it gets you in their space and time, right? And it helps you to better understand why a person is the way they are. And for me, it allowed me to respect him at a different level. Again, I knew he was an advocate, but I didn't realize that this advocacy had started at such a young age. And I remember him telling me, he said, back then you'd read in the papers and lynchings, articles or about lynchings was a commonplace. And we're thinking, oh my gosh, strange fruit from trees, and that's common back then? He's like, yeah, it was. And I asked him, had he ever seen that? The answer was no. He had never seen someone being lynched or passed someone who had been lynched. But he said it was in the papers all the time. So why he was passionate about certain things made a lot of sense to me. Why he, as a child who had been abused, was not an abusive father. Once I understood his why and what he fought so hard to not be, made so much sense to me. So I share this during Veterans Day to say our veterans, our men and women out there, have some amazing stories of heroism, of triumph, of pain, of suffering, of rising victorious, of overcoming, that we want to weave into the fabric of our story, which then becomes the American story. You don't have to just, say, well, I don't know, I wish I had asked. So remember, I told you today when I was in the parade, the Veterans Day parade, and we stopped at the park. That was the ending spot. And this lady came up to me, and she appeared to be in her mid-70s, and she noticed my jacket, which sparked a conversation. And she said, I wish I had had those conversations with my dad. She said when he died, that was the one thing she lamented about. She told her mom, I never asked Dad key questions. I just never asked. He was just Dad. He just, he worked, he came home, he was a provider, but I never sat and had the conversations with Dad. I wish I had talked to Dad. And so her mother said, well, Write down your questions, and I will try my best to answer as many as I can. And her mother did, which gives her something, yes? And that's a good thing. But she said, but that was my mother's perspective. That was my mother assessing how my dad may have answered, but it wasn't Dad's answer. But she said, but that's all I have. And it's something that it's a little piece of our family history that I can pass down. So again, when we think about preserving our history and telling our story, ask yourself, are you okay with knowing that this wonderful life that you're living, this impact that you're making, this ripple effect that you're causing will only last for 2 generations? Or are you determined to make sure that it's indelible? And how do you do that? Start by telling the story, finding a way to record it, right? Audio, written, video. Find a way to preserve it, to protect it, where other people know how to get it. There are different organizations that are popping up now that are preserving these conversations in book form. So it's like your own family history book. Or you can go to sites like ancestry.com and begin to do a deeper dive. Build your family tree. It gives you little leaves of hints so you can learn more and more about that particular ancestor. If you choose to do that, you may say, well, look, we'll start at our nucleus family, and maybe we'll give each member one person, or maybe that person works on themselves, right? And starts to tell you who they are, that you can begin adding to on a digital platform. Now, some of you may think, okay, that's great, LaWanna. That's too much work. It's too much work. But I want to ask you, how many of you wish you could go back and have a conversation with that grandmother or grandfather, or maybe that great, maybe walk the streets that they walked to better understand where you come from, to have a sense of belonging that's greater than what you have now? Because when you have a greater sense of knowing, there's a greater sense of belonging. So I just want to encourage you to do what you can. I challenge you on this Choose to Challenge to take the time to preserve your history, tell your story, and help your children to understand how they can find their voice and not be ashamed, and boldly, unapologetically change the systems, norms, mental blocks that may be preventing them from elevating to their greatest and highest selves, be preventing them from opening up their mouth. Show them the way to be true to their voice, to not sideline themselves, to get in the game, to defy convention, to choose to write their narrative, their history, and not leave it up to chance, not leave it up to someone who's imparting their own biases and limited views on what your lived experience is like. You are a part of living history. And one day your future generations will look back and see you as history. What story do you want them to tell about you? I'm LaWanna Bradford. Thank you so much for joining me for a special Veterans Day edition, preserving your history, telling your story. I look forward to seeing you next week for another edition of Choose to Challenge. Be safe, be well, and remember, in life and in business, when your vision intersects with opportunity, success is inevitable. Be well. Bye for now.